You're a bad person, right? I mean, isn't that why you come to church every Sunday? Just so that you can hear someone like me tell you how awful and sinful and miserable you are? Isn't that why you do this? It's kind of that age-old debate, right, that we've kind of been debating for centuries. At their core, are humans fundamentally good or bad? This is a question. Well, maybe the answer is more nuanced than we give it credit for. Sometimes, in order to get to the bottom of difficult truths like this, you know what you have to do? You have to apply a little bit of electricity. Yeah. That's what psychologist Molly Crockett and some colleagues at University College London discovered recently. You see, up until now, most lab experiments related to altruism have mostly supported the idea that humans are intrinsically selfish. This topic has been of great interest, of course, to psychologists, especially as it relates to psychopathy, because you may be aware that psychopaths are people who have a lack of concern for the feelings or suffering of others, and this has been this huge area of study over the years as we try to understand the human psyche better. So psychologists have long wanted to understand what drives some of us to being so cruel, while others of us can be so philanthropic, so altruistic, so kind and generous. And it's a very interesting discussion. Endless theories have been offered up as to why we're so selfish. Evolutionary explanations of protecting one's own bloodline or survival of the fittest are often at the top of the list. But when Crockett and her colleagues applied a little electricity, they were most intrigued. Some of you are like, just get to the electricity already, right? You want to know, what did they do with the electricity? Some of you are really sadistic, right? You really are. Crockett and her colleagues devised an experiment that gave 80 pairs of volunteers the option of shocking themselves or someone else in return for profit, like money. At low levels of electricity, participants were willing to allow their partner to receive the shock in order to get paid. But as the levels moved from 0, which is imperceptible, to 10, which is intolerable, things changed. As the shock level got up around 8, which is pretty high, participants became more willing to suffer pain themselves than to get paid for hurting someone else. They found that on average, people were willing to sacrifice about twice as much money to prevent another person from being shocked than to prevent themselves from being shocked. Molly Crockett was like, wow, this is an interesting discovery. You know, it's an experiment that made me think a couple of thoughts immediately. The first thought was, how do I get a job doing experiments like that? Because that would be really fun. That was the first thought. It passed very quickly, and it moved on to more noble thoughts, okay? The second thought that I had was, this really highlights what the Bible has always said. We've talked about it before here at Renew Church, that while we are sinful beings with a fallen nature, that there is a part of us that is loving, that is compassionate. Many people are like, I don't even know where it comes from, but we have that somewhere deep inside it. It often gets masked by the selfishness, but it's there. For as much as churches talk about mankind's depravity, the Bible actually confirms that our first nature is divine. And this is really important to understand. Theologians have coined the term imago Dei, which is Latin for image of God, in relation to this first nature that we possess. As it says in Genesis 1:26, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, in the likeness of God. The Trinity is in focus there, and we're seeing that in the image of God, we have been created. We know, of course, that Adam and Eve disobeyed God, that mankind fell into sin, that our nature became corrupted, and all of this. But, and this is important to understand, the imago Dei was not lost in that. It's still there, often hidden under layers of sinfulness, but it's there. It is why we still do find people who act in selfless ways. It's why when we crank that electricity up, there are still most people that are wanting to take that pain themselves rather than put it on someone else. It's also why I can introduce this week's big idea, knowing that you have the capacity to achieve what we are going to talk about this morning. Welcome back to the Genius of Jesus, week 2. This week's world-changing idea is love your enemies. Oh, come on, guys, that's just wrong. Don't be doing that. Let's move to the right slide. All right. Thank you. So disrespectful. The command to love our enemies is one of the hallmarks of Jesus' teaching. But you may be interested to know that he wasn't actually the first one to teach this. He wasn't. In fact, you can go all the way back to the Akkadian society and the Akkadian councils of wisdom. This is 2,000 years before the time of Christ, and you will see that they talked about loving your enemies. There are Buddhist writings centuries before Christ, Taoist writings centuries before Christ. Even in the Old Testament, so this is going back 1,000 years before Christ, look at what it says in Proverbs 25. It says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. So this is not a new concept, this idea of loving your enemies. I suspect it is most often credited to Jesus for a couple of reasons. First of all, he spoke about it so clearly. No other teacher that we know of spent so much time really camped out on this idea and spoke about it in so many different ways and in such depth. And secondly, and this is so important, Jesus actually backed the concept up with his life and death. And that's huge. You're probably familiar with Jesus' record as it relates to loving his enemies. If not, I'll remind you in Luke 23, it says, when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And there's something about putting your money where your mouth is, and that really drives the lesson home, doesn't it? It's kind of like that whole ethos thing that Aristotle talked about, that credibility that comes from the person of your character. And Jesus had that in spades. Jesus is really the one who popularized love your enemies, this idea that taps into the imago Dei in every one of us. It says inside every one of us is the image of God. It's been covered over by sin, by our sinful nature, but it's still there. In fact, I had to chuckle recently because everybody, it appears, knows that this is what we should be about. They know that this is what's really good and that this is a big idea that humanity needs to grasp onto. And a company that you may have heard of, McDonald's, actually has started using the concept in their own commercials. Take a look at this.
And 2 for candlelights, and 3 for long walks in the sun. 4 for all the laughter, 5 for ever after, 6 your smile is just the best. Love is endless. Love, 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 love. Love, love, love. Love, love, love. Love is endless. 13, I've got brand new eyes. 14, everything's a surprise. 15, not a day that I regret. Love is endless.
Yeah, and then they brand you with the little audio hook at the end. Very interesting that even McDonald's is getting into this. Love your enemies. That's from a campaign that is called Arch Enemies, and there are different versions of the commercial. I think it's just playing south of the border right now, but I've even seen versions of it with hockey players in it fighting instead of the football fans. So very interesting stuff, something you could check into. McDonald's probably spent millions, tens of millions, coming up with this campaign. You could have just come here to Renew Church, right? Because we talk about this stuff. Love your enemies. Matthew chapter 5, look at what Jesus said. I want you to see it for yourself. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, in Luke's gospel, we get another rendition of this same teaching, but he fills in some different information. Let's take a look at that one as well. But you who are listening, I say, to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, Bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Now, this is a powerful teaching, a big idea here, an idea that changes the world. And I want to answer some of the questions that are probably jumping to your mind even as you're hearing Jesus speak on this topic. Let me jump right into those. Here's the first one that usually comes to mind. Does loving your enemies mean I ignore the hurt that my enemy has caused? A lot of people ask this question. Well, love your enemy. Does that mean I just gloss it over? I deny it? No, in fact, we actually are called to blame people for what they do. That's being truthful. When someone does something wrong, we need to call it what it is. God actually says in the Old Testament, woe to the person who calls good evil and evil good. Loving your enemy is not denying what they've done. It is just choosing to treat them differently than what they deserve. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second question that comes up a lot. Does love your enemy mean that I have to agree with my enemy? Some people have said, well, if I'm going to love them, that means that I'm agreeing with them. Not at all. Often we won't agree, but we can, when necessary, agree to disagree. This last week, I was traveling to a focus retreat down in Ohio for pastors, and we had 6 pastors from Renewed Church that headed down for that, all packed in one minivan. And Pastor Mitch from the Milton site informed us that he had never tried Chick-fil-A before. How many of you have never tried Chick-fil-A before? It's not in Canada, it's just in the U.S., okay? This is probably something you want to get on your bucket list, all right, at some point. Chick-fil-A, it's a fast food outlet that specializes, of course, in chicken. You may have seen some of the creative billboards that they have around with cows painting signs saying, eat more chicken, right? It's in their interest, of course. But it is a very tasty and well-done restaurant. It's very good. And what's interesting is the founder of Chick-fil-A, Truett Cathy, who is now deceased, was followed by his son, Dan Cathy. And a few years back, controversy arose when Dan Cathy actually expressed publicly his opinion. I think he was asked, but he expressed his opposition to gay marriage. Now, enemies may be too strong a term, but an LGBT group called Campus Pride started a large boycott against Chick-fil-A restaurants at that time. And, these kinds of disagreements, they come up in a lot of different areas of life, but they can posture us as enemies. And I would say for sure the media started pitting these guys immediately as enemies, and they wanted to, that's kind of what the media does, and they wanted to stir it up. Well, interestingly enough, Cathy, very privately, reached out to Shane Windmeyer, who was the leader of Campus Pride. He met with him, talked with him very calmly, very respectfully, and the two actually became friends, agreeing to disagree. In fact, I want to read a little bit of an article that appears in Christianity Today. And this actually also appeared in a column for Huffington Post. It says, throughout the conversations, this is Windmeyer actually sharing his experience in meeting Dan Cathy. It says, throughout the conversations, Dan expressed a sincere interest in my life, wanting to get to know me on a personal level. He wanted to know about where I grew up, my faith, my family, even my husband, Tommy. In return, I learned about his wife and kids and gained an appreciation for his devout belief in Jesus Christ and his commitment to being a follower of Christ more than a Christian. Dan expressed regret and genuine sadness when he heard of people being treated unkindly in the name of Chick-fil-A. But he offered no apologies for his genuine beliefs about marriage. Windmeyer continued, in many ways, getting to know Dan better has reminded me of my relationship with my uncle, who was a pastor at a Pentecostal church. When I came out as openly gay in college, I was aware that his religious views were not supportive of homosexuality. But my personal relationship with my uncle reassured me of his love for me, and that love extends to my husband. My relationship with Dan is the same. Though he is not my family, Dan in his heart is driven by his desire to minister to others and had to choose to continue our relationship throughout this controversy. He had to both hold to his beliefs and welcome me into them. He had to face the issue of respecting my viewpoints in life, even while not being able to reconcile them with his own belief system. He defined this to me as the blessing of growth. He expanded his world without abandoning it. I did as well. So it's interesting to see what happens when people come together who have divergent opinions and perspectives on things, how much agreement can actually be found, and how much love there can be. There's a difference between love and agreement. Always remember that. Here's the third thing. Does love your enemies mean that governments should also turn the other cheek? We see this commendation here in the passage that if someone strikes us on the cheek, we should offer them the other cheek and put ourselves in that position. Well, we know from Scripture that revenge belongs to God. God says He will repay. But the government does exercise judgment on God's behalf, and this is a principle we also learn in the New Testament. Look at Romans chapter 13. It says, "For the one in authority, the ruler, the king, whoever, is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason." Listen, "they are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer." You see that? They are God's servants, it says. Governments are actually acting on God's behalf. This is why it's such a huge responsibility when someone steps into an office as a governing official. It's a huge responsibility. You see, governments have the responsibility to uphold the law on God's behalf. Jesus here was primarily addressing individuals and how they respond to those who oppose them on a personal level. And it's important to distinguish between the two of those. Number 4, does loving your enemies mean that I need to continue to allow myself to be hurt? Because it can certainly sound like that, can't it? If someone strikes you on the cheek, offer him the other cheek. And you have to be really careful here. And I'm going to just put this right out there. If you are in an abusive situation where you have someone, particularly like a spouse, who is abusing you, maybe even physically hitting you, you need to come and speak with me or speak with someone, and you need to get out of that situation. This is not what we're talking about here. But do understand that what we are talking about here is that Jesus is sharing a very powerful ideal, and it is the ideal of grace. You see, we have to understand the difference between law and grace. Law is the rules. It is God saying, this is the way I think, this is what is just, this is what is fair, and it is a certain level of an ideal. Grace goes beyond that into a different realm, a higher ideal. Now, the way that this works is that the law is what is required. You have to do certain things according to God's law. The 10 Commandments, still as Christians today, we follow those 10 Commandments because they show what God thinks. It's His law. But grace is an invitation. It is something, it's a higher ideal that Jesus is inviting us to. It is a higher way of thinking. But here's the thing. A person must first learn that they have the right to defend themselves and to claim their rights before they can choose not to defend themselves and not to claim their rights. Are you following what I'm saying here? You have to have the foundation of law first to know what is just and fair before you can then offer grace to people. In other words, you can choose to allow yourself to be hurt if you want to. That's the bottom line of this question. You can do that. I've known people that have allowed themselves to continue to be in situations that were, painful in a variety of different ways, but they were doing it consciously out of their choice as a gift of grace that they were offering to someone, something that they did not deserve. And Jesus says we have that opportunity. Jesus gave the ultimate example of that on the cross. Look at what it says in Romans chapter 5. It says, even when we were God's enemies, you get that? We were God's enemies because of our sin. He made peace with us because His Son died for us. Jesus didn't have to go on the cross. He even said He had the power to call down 10,000 angels even while He was hanging there on the cross. And He didn't. He allowed Himself to suffer. But it was His choice. He was following the higher ideal of grace. Number 5, a question that comes to mind. It says, what assurance do I have that the offender will ever change if I don't fight back? A lot of people have asked this question. And you see certain battles that keep going on all of the time, back and forth. Because they're saying, if I don't take this in my own hands, if I don't fight back, what guarantee do I have that they will ever change? And you know what the answer to that question is? It's none. You don't have any guarantee. But the chances are better than if you fight back. I can tell you that. Like Gandhi said, an eye for an eye will only make the whole world blind, eventually, right? It's a great line, isn't it? Eventually, that's what's going to happen. So what Jesus is saying is that there's a better way to deal with our enemies, those who oppose us. And love is that better way. Love your enemies. I want to take the rest of our time here this morning explaining why loving your enemy is so much better, why it really is the better way, why it's such a great ideal to strive toward. Here's the first reason. The first is simply because it is godlike. And we saw it right here in the passage in Matthew 5. Jesus actually said, if you do this, if you love your enemies, if you treat people well that have treated you badly, he says, you do it that you may be children of your Father in heaven. You hear that? You can be God's child. It's his way of saying you will be like him in this way. Whenever, in that time they spoke about being someone's child, they were talking not just about this kind of physical, you're my, it's a father-child relationship, but they were saying being one after the kind of. To be a child of God is to be one after the kind of God. You are being like God in the way that you behave. Then he says also in that passage, he causes the sun to rise on the evil and on the good. And he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. You ever thought about how good God is? How gracious he is? How patient, how long-suffering, how he waits? You know what it'd be like if I was God, right? There'd be like little clouds following certain people, right? And the sun burning down on other people. Like it wouldn't be what we see, right? God's long-suffering and he's kind to his enemies. And we are his children when we act the same way, Jesus says. The second reason why we should love our enemies is because it is liberating. It's so freeing. Loving our enemy frees us from the cycle of hatred. It actually helps us to see the humanity in every person. We aren't enslaved to living in anger and pain and hurt. The truth, in a group this size, I know that there are people here this morning. Some of you this morning have demonized someone in your life. You've demonized someone. You've taken their humanity away. They've done something to you. They've hurt you. They've offended you. They've opposed you in something. And you have now demonized them. You've said, there's nothing good in this person. You've lost sight completely of the imago Dei in that person. You're holding on to your desire for revenge, but here's the truth. You are the one who is enslaved, not them. And you need to be liberated from that. And this is what loving your enemies actually does. It frees you. Thirdly, you need to love your enemies because revenge is not ours to take. It's not for us. In Romans 12:19, it says, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." Jesus said that God's job is to judge, and our job is to what? Love. Our job is to love. The fourth reason why we love our enemies is because it will actually be rewarded someday. Now, it's not improper to look forward to a reward. Sometimes we think, oh, well, that's mixing motives and so on. No, God actually is really big on this kind of thing, and he will reward us. It's not about, we don't get into his kingdom this way, but once we're his children, he will reward us for the way that we behave. Both passages that we read here this morning talk about reward, that we will get reward if we love our enemies. And I think that's talking about immediate reward, but I think it's talking about future reward as well. The Luke passage actually uses that word credit 3 times in that short little passage. In other words, what it's saying is God is keeping score. Aren't you glad you don't have to keep score anymore? Because God's keeping score. And he will keep score. And he will reward you. Not only will he take revenge where it's necessary, but he will reward you for your patience, for your long-suffering, for the love that you extend, the grace, that undeserved favor you offer. Last one, number 5, we need to love our enemies because it really changes people. You see, love is powerful. The Bible actually says we can use it to overcome evil with good. You can actually overcome evil with good. In Romans 12:21, which is the same passage we were just reading on revenge, he comes back and he says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And we do this with love. Instead of taking revenge on our enemies, we follow God's formula. And if you look in Luke chapter 6, that second passage, you actually see a clear formula emerging. And I want you to see it here. Look at this verse, Luke 6:27. It says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. You see the action items? Love your enemies. Now it's going to define it. Do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. That's the formula. Let's break it down. First of all, do good. Guys, you just need to do good things for people. If you look in the Greek, it's the same thing. Do good. Do nice things for people that hurt you. You say, no, I don't want to. Of course you don't. But you can actually physically do something. You can make yourself do something that even your mind and spirit don't want to do. And you'll be moving in the right direction. The second thing you can do is the word bless. In the Greek, that's actually the word eulogeo. And it is the exact transliteration from whence we get the word today, eulogy. Right? How many of you have ever been to a funeral and you got called on to give a eulogy and you went up there and you started talking? You said, this dude was a nasty dude, right? This old codger, he ripped me off, right? No, we don't do that at funerals, right? I hope you don't do that at funerals, right? It's a eulogy. You're speaking well of them, right? Sometimes it's hard to find some stuff, right, to say at those moments, but that's what we're there for. And when it relates to our enemies, you may find it's hard to find something good to say too. But Jesus says you need to do it. You need to eulogize the person. You need to speak well of them. You know how you're tempted whenever you're with someone else and that person comes up, that person that's hurt you, that person that opposes you, what you want to say and how easy it seems to flow out of your mouth. Jesus says you need to put a cork in that, and then you need to actually say something good. You need to find something nice to say about that person. The third thing he says is that we need to pray. We need to actually bring God into the situation, ask him to help, and even ask God to change that person. That's legitimate. God knows they need to be changed, right? Maybe there's something in us that needs to be changed too. Now, earlier I quoted from the Proverbs, but I only gave half of the verse. I want you to see the rest of it. Proverbs 25, it says, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. 1,000 years before Jesus said it, that was there. But then look at what it also says. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Now, this idea of heaping burning coals on someone's head sounds a little bit like revenge, which is why some of you smiled, right? When you, like, I can do that. I can do that. Good Christian I am. I can totally do that, right? That's not what it's saying, okay? Put the coals down, right? Put the electricity away. No, the idea here is that you're actually, in doing something nice for them, you're actually going to embarrass them. There's a level to which it's going to shame them, and it's actually appropriate because they deserve to feel what's really going on. They deserve to feel the legitimate, justice and injustice of the situation. The proverb doesn't say that your enemy's behavior will necessarily change, but his heart will start to change, right? And you see it even by the facial reaction sometimes. Maybe you've been there. You've done something nice for someone that didn't deserve it. And you see them, they're like, oh, right? They weren't expecting to react that way toward you. And you weren't expecting to see them react that way toward you. And all of a sudden, you've started something positive. One of the best stories I've ever heard on this matter is the story of a police officer named Van de Broek. And an author named Ed Bacon retells the story in a book that he wrote called 8 Habits of Love. And I want you to hear this story because it's amazingly powerful. Shortly after the apartheid rule in South Africa was ended and Nelson Mandela was inaugurated president of a new non-racial South Africa, he established what was known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Many of you would have heard of this. It sought to bring light to all of the heinous transgressions committed by both sides of the conflict during that bloody period. The rules were simple. If you gave a full confession acknowledging your guilt to those you harmed, you would not be punished. The underpinning theory was that this fragile new nation could progress toward its destiny of freedom and equality only to the degree that its past received the healing light and balm of both truth and reconciliation, hence the name. Offering forgiveness to truth-tellers was the only way forward. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the iconic face of this commission, said in his book, there is no future without forgiveness. One day, the commission brought in an elderly black woman to face the white policeman, Mr. Van de Broek, who had tortured, murdered, and then cremated the lady's son and husband some years earlier. Now, I actually read an account of this, and this is going very easy in the description. It was absolutely disgusting what happened. The scope of his depravity extended to forcing this wife and mother to witness his unspeakable crimes against her family members. The last words she heard her husband speak before he finally died were, "Father, forgive them." How do you believe justice should be done to this man who has inflicted such suffering on you and so brutally destroyed your family? Asked one of the members of the commission. She said she wanted Van de Broek to go to the place where they burned her husband's body and gather up the dust so that she could give him a decent burial. He bent his head low. The policeman nodded in agreement. The old woman paused, collecting herself, and then continued, "Mr. Van de Broek took all of my family away from me, and I still have a lot of love to give. Twice a month, I would like for him to come to the ghetto and spend a day with me so that I can be a mother to him." But she had one last wish. "I would like Mr. Van de Broek to know that he is forgiven by God and that I forgive him too." She asked for someone to lead her across the courtroom. "I would like to embrace him so that he can know that he is truly forgiven." You can imagine the hush over this courtroom. When he heard these words, Mr. Van de Broek fainted. He fell to the ground. Together, the friends, family, and neighbors gathered in the hearing room, all victims of repression and discrimination, and began to sing the hymn, "Amazing Grace." This story always leaves me wanting to take a deep breath, Ed Bacon says, and have a moment to pause. This kind of forgiveness is difficult to fathom, and yet it always remains as a choice for an individual or a nation that has been severely wounded. This remarkable mother, who is an exemplar of what it means to be human, made the instinctive connection between forgiveness and her own desire to live according to her loving self when she said that she wanted the perpetrator to become her son so that she could pour her remaining love into him. To those who have been deeply scarred, this choice may appear outrageous or out of the realm of the possible. But in order to create an interior world of freedom, as well as an external world of peace and justice, the habit of forgiveness must be engaged. Guys, loving your enemies is one of the most powerful ideas that you will ever come across. It is divine. It is beyond human. It is divine in its scope. It is how good overcomes evil. And I'll just tell you, it is genius. Jesus taught it, and more importantly, he modeled it for us. I'm going to ask you just to do me a favor and just bow your head and close your eyes for a second this morning. Whatever site you're at, just bow your head, close your eyes. I want you to think of that person who has hurt you the most. I want you to think of that person, bring their face up into your mind, that person who is opposing you, who resists you, who creates so much anger and frustration inside of you. You see, it's really hard to know where to start with this loving your enemy thing. Love is so intangible sometimes, and you can wait for a feeling and just find that it's never coming. And sometimes people will use that to get themselves off the hook. They're like, well, I wanted to love them, I just didn't feel the feeling coming back. Jesus gave us 3 really practical ways to bring love for our enemies to life. And we looked at them there in Luke 6. Remember? Do good, bless, pray. I want you to remember these 3 ideas this week. Do good, bless, and pray. Not only has this idea changed our world, it can change yours too if you let it. And this week, here's what I want you to do. I want you to do those 3 things for that person that came into your mind. I'm challenging you this week. I want you to do those 3 things. I want you to do something nice for them. I want you to speak well of them. And I want you to pray. I want you to ask God to help them. even to change them, and maybe even change you in the way that you need to change. I want you to do all three things for that person this week. And here's the other thing. I want you to tell somebody about it. Don't let yourself off the hook. I want you to tell someone about it, even as you're going home today. Say, this is the person, and I'm going to do this. We'll see you next Sunday.